Awesome, Chris. So we are live. So Chris Younger, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. And thanks for doing what you're doing for folks out there trying to buy companies. That's a great service.
This is a ton of fun. I could talk about this stuff all day. And just previously, before we jumped online, we are talking about Jackson Hole and the outdoors, and I'm sure we could have talked for hours on that. So I know
Yeah.
you live in Denver. Appreciate you jumping on the show. You have such a fascinating background. Um, you've done a lot of acquisitions, and you've been in the mergers and acquisition space your whole career. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I started out as an attorney. I'm fully recovered. I've been through the 12 steps, and I were actually clerked for a federal judge for a year, and then I spent 2 years out in Silicon Valley, working for a law firm there called Wilson Sonsini. And really, that was my first introduction to working with entrepreneurs, and really enjoyed it. Found them to be great personalities, you know, super interesting people to spend time with, and developed a high regard for them. And then, uh, however, I didn't really like practicing law, and so I left the practice of law and went to work for an investor group, of all places in South Dakota. And through that, we started Exponets, this communications company, and so I was the deal guy. And so the goal of that business was to consolidate the value added reseller space in the communications industry. So these were businesses that were selling phone systems to small, medium sized businesses. And so I had all of 2 years of legal experience, and then I was in charge of doing these acquisitions. And so I was fortunate. We had a an accounting team and a legal team that helped on those sides, and then a couple of industry consultants that helped us, just understand those businesses. But definitely trial by fire. We acquired 27 companies over the course of a couple of years, and those deals ranged from deals that were a $5 million deal, and then we did a deal that was where we acquired a division of Lucent that represented about $800 million of revenue. So it was a big span. And then after we finished the acquisitions, we had to integrate all these businesses. And so the guy who was the CEO, a guy by the name of Jim Walker, asked if I wanted to join the business, right? Instead of just being the deal guy, hey, he said, would you like to join the business and leave the investment group and work for the company? And so I started out heading up their marketing and strategy, then became the COO, and then became the president of that business, that we ultimately sold to Avaya, another communications company here in the US. And so I learned quite a bit, right? Doing all those acquisitions was a lot of, I always joke, of the 27 deals, there's 9 of them that went really, really well. I probably look smarter than I really am. 9 of them went pretty much as planned, and 9 of them I absolutely should have been fired for doing. And those, of course, those 9 are the ones you learn the most from. And then having to integrate all those. I took over as the COO right before we were doing the cutover of the information system. We did a big Siebel Oracle, and I always joke that I used to be a lot taller before I went through that experience. It was pretty painful. And so we integrated those businesses. We went through 9/11, dealt with the system cutover, and then ultimately sold that business. But it was there were a lot of years of learning in those 2 years of doing that integration work.
So you went from an attorney to the deal guy to the president, and I would say very few people have actually been able to see all those different parts of the business and approach things in such a unique way. And also, I would imagine everybody thought you were crazy when you moved from the Bay Area as an attorney and said, "Hey, I'm actually moving to South Dakota."
Yeah. Talk to my wife about that conversation, because she was also practicing law in Silicon Valley. And I had concluded that I was not going to continue to practice law. And so I went to my boss and said, I've decided this is not what I want to do. And so I had quit already. I had no other job teed up, but I knew that if I were continuing to practice, I mean, those are 80 or 100-hour weeks. So there was no time to actually do any searching and so a buddy of mine and I were going to do a search fund, to go raise money, to go look for a business to buy. And then we met this investment group, and they offered to hire us. to help lead their acquisition activity. And so, I came home to Mary Beth's my wife's name. I said, Mary Beth, I got good news and bad news. The good news is I'm going to be employed, right? Instead of being unemployed. But the bad news is it's in South Dakota. So we negotiated a deal, and I think I've delivered on everything that I promised. But she's, as I say, I way out kicked my coverage for sure when I married. So, but she still practices, which is great.
Yeah, there's a lot there, I would imagine. And I'm sure it was tough, a lot of sleepless nights, the fact that you left without something lined up. But, when you work 80 to 100-hour weeks, you don't have time to build anything else or try anything new. And so hindsight's 2020, you might look back and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. But I imagine in the time, it was a risky decision keeping you up at night. And of course, your wife's like, wait, we're moving from the beautiful Bay Area with all these great food options and international flights and go travel anywhere we want to, hey, we're going to move to the middle of nowhere. Nothing against South Dakota, but it's a culture shock for sure.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And that first winter was the coldest winter on record in South Dakota. So I had that going for me too. So it was pretty bad.
Yeah. You just jump in and buy your big winter coats. So you bought 27 businesses in 2 years, which is just incredible. Now you already answered my question. So 9 worked incredibly well. 9 were okay, kind of hummed and hawed what they were supposed to do, and then 9 totally failed. And I think one of the things that you'd mentioned is that you should have been fired for some of them, should have been promoted for some of the others. And so I think sometimes when things go well, we give ourselves too much credit. When things go badly, we're like, oh, not, quick to maybe not accept some of that credit. What did you learn from some of those that didn't necessarily work out so well?
One of the things that we learned now, this will be different than what some of your listeners are going through, right? They want to acquire a business and operate it. So we were trying to acquire companies that basically we could acquire them and they would continue to operate. And so we weren't going to place new people into those businesses. So we were really relying on the team that existed to manage those businesses going forward. And one of the big lessons that we learned was if the key person in the business were the entrepreneur that we were writing the check to, right? If they were responsible or led sales, or if they were responsible or led operations, or were somehow otherwise critical to the business, those deals were much, much tougher post-closing than companies where they had a really strong number 2, right? A COO or a president. And I think the reasoning is, as entrepreneurs, and I'm one today, we're not really great at being good employees. All that said, though, if you have somebody who's used to being an employee and who has run a successful company reporting to somebody else, they were great to work with. The transition for them was a lot easier. But, the moment that you write that check to that entrepreneur, their life changes and, the motivations are different. So I would, the big lesson that I took is, if you're going to acquire a business and you're relying on that team to execute, having a strong number 2, because that entrepreneur's motivations are going to change, they're likely to leave. And so, making sure that you had a good transition plan and somebody that was a good number 2 place was really important. I think the other piece that, and I think this will be relevant to your listeners, is being crystal clear about what you're buying. When you buy a business, you're buying the assets to that business, you're buying the ongoing operations, you might be acquiring elements of the balance sheet. But one of the things that I think most people forget about is you want to have acute clarity around what is the key piece of that business that is going to be critical for the success of that business going forward. And I'll give you an example. In the Exponets days, it really was the people, right? We needed to have, because the customer relationships were there, the delivery, the installation teams, it was all people. And so being crystal clear about, all right, so if people in this business, if people are the main asset, what do I need to do to make sure that I protect that asset? That's communication planning, making sure that the benefits programs that we were putting in place were as good or better, making sure that we didn't upset the apple cart in terms of their roles and responsibilities. Conversely, one of my old bosses was one of the early guys at Nextel, as an old cellular carrier, and they bought, to build their business, they bought taxi cab companies, which sounds strange, but taxi cab companies owned the frequency in those specific municipalities, right? Or those geographic areas. And so for them, the critical asset that has nothing to do with people, it was the frequency, right? The spectrum that those taxi cab companies owned. And so I think when you buy a company, you really want to nail down what is it that you're buying, and imagine the 15 different ways that that asset could degrade in value or disappear, and then develop your game plan around trying to protect that and deal with those eventualities, because it's going to happen. Acquisitions are challenging.
Love how you said there's 15 ways that this can disappear. You might think of 5 of them, you might think of 8 of them, but there's probably 15, and maybe some of them are black swan events. But we just went through 2020.
Right.
Black swan events do happen. So when you're integrating all these, it's really easy to say, hey, there's some synergy across all these businesses. It's a fun word to say, but it's incredibly difficult to implement.
Oh.
So how did you go about implementing, you got 27 new divisions ranging from 5 million to, did you say 800 million in revenue?
Yeah.
How do you go about kind of syncing these across the board in such a short amount of time?
So fortunately, when all these businesses were in the same industry, right? So we were, the core business processes were relatively similar. I mean, the sales processes were fairly similar. The execution and implementation processes were relatively similar. And so we did a lot of work just trying to map those processes, right? Understand, hey, what's common? What are the things that we want to plan for in a new system, and how we're going to do business? And so we spent a fair amount of time mapping those processes, making sure that we had something that was consistent. And then, I'm simplifying here, but then you're looking at Siebel and Oracle. Those were the 2 platforms that we executed on. And I will say it was a nosebleed, right? One of the things that we learned was, you're much better off with those really sophisticated software solutions to take your processes and modify them to meet what's pretty much out of the box in those big applications, versus, and this is where I think we made some mistakes, trying to customize that software to map to your current processes. Because that became very apparent fairly early that we had made several mistakes, again, in trying to customize this piece of software, which was already world-class software. Hey, we were trying to customize it. And that it just creates problems. But I think again, integrating those businesses, probably the next big challenge just culturally, when you acquire a business the size of Lucent's, it was their SMB group, small and medium-sized business group, that culture is a radically different culture than a 5, 10, $20 million revenue entrepreneurial run company, right? Those are radically different cultures. And so trying to integrate those, I think I think some of it worked out pretty well, and other parts of it were pretty challenging.
I think you go in knowing that if you're going to buy, 20 to 30 companies, maybe that was your goal that you set out, or maybe you had kind of your strategy to go acquire a bunch of companies that you just know that some of them are going to be duds and some of them are going to be home runs. And in the end, kind of the net benefit will exceed some of the losses that you have there. Just out of curiosity, anytime someone says they buy 27 companies, how do you fund 27 companies in 2 years? So did you get creative on the financing? Was there kind of an equity bank behind that, or investment bank behind that? Or how do you fund that many acquisitions?
Yeah, we were fortunate. There was a public utility that had funded all of the equity side of what we were going to do. And then we were able to get a debt financing line in place to be able to do those acquisitions. So, fortunately, there weren't a lot of challenges from a capital perspective in doing those acquisitions.
Did you find that when you were acquiring a lot of these companies, you were paying a smaller multiple than when you kind of rolled them all up, your multiple got higher before you had that exit? Or what was kind of the overall strategy with that?
Yeah, in general, right? And I think you've talked about this before, right? If you can, if you're able to acquire businesses that are smaller, you're generally going to pay a lower multiple. You might be able to acquire businesses at 3 to 5 times. And then as that business scales, the multiples go up. And we see that in our business today, right? If you have a larger business, you're going to have, it's going to be less risky in a lot of regards, right? You're typically not going to have big customer concentration issues in terms of your revenue sources. your team is going to be deeper, right? You're not going to have this business being solely dependent on the owner. You're going to have probably better supply chain security because you've worked some of those issues out. Your systems are probably going to be more mature. And so again, as a business matures and it gets bigger, those valuations are going to be higher because the business becomes less risky. A much smaller business where it's highly dependent on the owner, or you've got big customer concentration issues, or maybe the revenue sources are limited, those are much more risky. And so, valuation is going to get discounted.
Right. That makes total sense. Overall within this process, so you kind of built this business over a few year span. What did it look like in terms of this large acquisition or large sale when you went to go sell the company, and being on the other side of that table, and things you learned of acquiring these companies that prepared you for the exit?
Yeah, it's a good question. The ultimate exit, we ended up selling to one of our vendors. So we were Avaya's largest vendor. We were NEC's largest vendor. We were Cisco's voice over IP telephony, their largest vendor. And so when we sold to Avaya, one of the reasons why Avaya was so interested was we had a big maintenance base where we had about $300 million of maintenance contracts on systems that they sold, it was their system. And so you learned really quickly, and we see this even today, businesses that have a really nice, recurring, predictable, ideally contracted, long-term revenue streams, those are going to be worth a lot more than the segment of our business that was project oriented. And so, I think the things that you learn when you're selling a business is you have to be able to translate the story that you're telling into language that the investor community is going to hear. We see this all the time. Entrepreneurs will talk about their business in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the way that the investment community hears and in the way that you want them to hear it. There's kind of two different languages. And so I think really spending time thinking about your story and why is it that somebody really would want to own your business, that's a critical kind of piece to be able to tell that story and tell it in a way, in a language that the investment community will hear.
Yeah, that's a good exercise really for anybody, right? So if you are looking to exit your company, you want to put yourself in their shoes, because ultimately what would you want if you were them? And a lot of times you're going to be pretty close to getting it, maybe 80, 90% accurate. Did you instigate some of those conversations? It sounds like you had several vendors that you worked with, pretty large contracts. It's natural for you to think, hey, this is a really good acquire of us. How did you start those conversations, or did they start those with you?
So we hired an investment bank, Bear Stearns, out of New York. And so they were responsible for helping us kind of market the business and take it out. And you learn a lot of lessons in that process too, right? I mean, today I run an investment bank, but one of the things that we learned really quickly was, that decision. So we hired Bear Stearns because they were, quote, the experts in the communications industry. But one of the things that we learned is, when you hire somebody who's an expert in a particular industry, there's a lot of potential for conflict. Bear Stearns had also done a fair amount of work for Avaya. And so, that's something, especially if you're on the sell side, you're hiring an investment bank, you want to be really clear that they're on your side and not necessarily have any potential conflicts.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. When you get into that size, right, there's just going to be crossover. You find that a lot with law firms where, they're big enough that they just have to, do their due diligence, that they might not be on the other side of this.
Right.
So, now you've done, since then you've started Class X Partners. You've done a lot of really interesting things. You also wrote a book, Harvest: The Definitive Guide to Selling Your Company. Let's dive into a little bit about selling your business, right? Since you've acquired a lot of companies, you've sold companies. Where I'm coming from before this question is, how can a business owner increase the value of their company before they sell? And where I'm coming from is, as a buyer, if you see these things not done, this could be part of your value add after you take it over.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ryan. I think when we think about value, right, one of the things we try to you want to kind of break it up a little bit, right? So we think about there's certainly financial value, right? Hey, is your business growing? Are the margins that you're generating expanding? When you look at the long-term value of a customer versus what it costs to acquire, are those ratios in line? So you have all the, what I would call traditional financial metrics. And in particular, hey, what does the future growth plan look like? So you kind of financial, then you kind of look at what's the growth prospects of the business and how supportable is that growth plan. It's remarkable to me when you talk to an entrepreneur or a business owner, they have a general sense for how they're going to grow, but in terms of the detailed plan and what that looks like from a personnel standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a capital standpoint, most entrepreneurs haven't done that work. But if you're going to go sell your business and present it to the investment community, you've got to do that work. You've got to build that growth story. Then you think about, what I call, it's almost like cleaning up your house before you sell it, right? We call it organizational. You have your books and records in place. Do you have your contracts for your top customers, your top suppliers? Are they executed? Are they easy to access? Are your books and records well organized? Do you have any legal issues? So you have to look at organizational, and then you look at customers. What's your customer base like? Do you have customer concentration? Meaning, is a lot of revenue coming from a single customer or a small group of customers? That introduces a lot of risk. As a buyer, right? If you saw that and you felt like you could expand that, hey, that puts you in a much better position, right? To be able to expand that revenue base. Are your customers of good credit quality, right? Are you selling to the Fortune 500, or are you selling to, folks that may not pay on time? Then you look at your team. How deep is the management team? And this is particularly for your listeners. It's likely that the acquisitions that you're going to be looking at, they're not going to have a deep team. But if you're able to bring not only your skill set, but then contemplate, hey, I'm going to be able to bring on, an executive team to bring additional skill sets, you'll make that business a lot more valuable. So depth of team, quality of the team, duration of the team, how long have they been together? And then you look at kind of, I think you've referred to it in some of your other podcasts as what's the moat, right? What is that barrier to entry? What is my strategic advantage? Is it a business where it's, yeah, I run faster and jump higher? Or is it a business where, hey, I've basically locked out the potential for somebody to really compete with me? You're looking for, do I have an exclusive territory? Do I have a patented product? Do I have a software application that, is protected? Those are the reasons why, people would need to stay out, away from your business. And so we look at that kind of wheel, and you examine each one of those different buckets. And we use our own application. It's called Copilot, but it basically allows us to examine a business really quickly. They answer about 120 questions. That allows a business really quickly to see, hey, do I have issues in any one of those different buckets? And certainly happy to make that available to your listeners. So,
yeah, that'd be awesome. Can you dive into a little bit about Copilot? So, is this a questionnaire that people can put in their information and it kind of spits out where the business is lacking on certain things, or how do you use that to examine the business?
Yeah, so we when we get engaged with a client, right, on the investment banking side, we'll sit down with that client and interview them for 3 or 4 hours, right? We really want to understand the business. We get their financials, we get information about the business, and we'll ask them a bunch of questions. So what we did with Copilot, we tried to make that process more automated and more objective. Because it's quite possible, Ryan, if you and I are having a conversation and I start asking you about a particular topic, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes, right? Whereas Copilot, it's the same 120 questions, right, that an owner fills out. And through that, we uncover or issue spot really quickly. Hey, by the way, we've identified these, 15 different risks in your business that you're going to need help with. And so really what Copilot does is you can go online, you complete the survey. And we've actually had, might be interesting for your listeners, we've actually had buyers use it on the company that they're about to buy. So they don't have the owner of the seller, right, fill it out, because you're not just sure what kind of information you're going to get, but they can fill it out as a buyer, and it will highlight for you, hey, here are the top risks that we see. And what Copilot does then is it prioritizes those risks based on how significant they are, but how easy or difficult they would be to fix and how expensive. And then it actually generates, hey, here's a description of the risk and 3 or 4 different ways you might be able to alleviate that risk or eliminate it.
So in the way you structure that is basically the Copilot software that you have would potentially help your growth strategy and in which order to do those different growth strategies.
Yeah, Copilot is really focused on, hey, what are the issues in your business that are going to limit value or make your business riskier? And then it prioritizes all those risks. And it'll, again, I like to tell people it's probably 70% of that interview process that we would normally do, but 70% is a lot better than zero. And it gives you a second set of eyes on, hey, we as entrepreneurs, we all view our business. You've heard the phrase, right? An owner always believes their business is a lot more valuable than it really is. And I like to think that that's because business owners, because you're managing the risk in your business day to day, you probably don't see that same level of risk in your own business that you would in somebody else's that you weren't familiar with. And so as a result, knowing those risks in your business from a second set of eyes, it will help you, again, kind of diagnose, hey, what should I start working on first?
Can you give a particular example and just the history that you have, and you can keep it vague and don't have to tell us the company, of just how you were able to identify business risk in a particular acquisition and then be okay with it, or how'd you mitigate that?
Sure. Well, going back to some of the acquisitions, right? As soon as you figure out, for example, that, and again, for your listeners, right, if you're looking at a business, you may quickly figure out, boy, if I'm the buyer and you're the seller, hey, I love Ryan's business, right? I love the markets that it's in. I think it's got great growth potential, but boy, Ryan is really, really critical to that business. He's primarily responsible for sales. He holds most of those customer relationships. So the moment that you identify that as a particular risk, you want to, before you complete that acquisition, you want to get to work on thinking through, all right, how am I going to transition those relationships from Ryan to me? Because I know that Ryan's ultimately going to retire, right? He wants to exit the business. This is why he's selling it to me. So then work on, so I understand that I need to get introduced to your customers. Okay, so Ryan, I'm going to need your help. So maybe I structure the transaction in a way that encourages you financially to help migrate those customer relationships over to me over a period of time. Also want to understand, how is Ryan selling today? Where is he getting his leads from? Do I need to go build relationship with those lead sources? So it's really identifying, it's kind of back to what we talked about earlier. Hey, if I see this asset, the customer relationships, and Ryan's primarily responsible for those, what are the strategies that I'm going to develop to make sure that I don't lose those relationships, right? Because that's so critical to the success of the business. And we've seen this time and time again. I mean, there are buyers out there who love turnarounds, right? They love businesses that are in distress because they can quickly come in and diagnose what the issues are. And, they've done it enough times that they know how to fix them, and fix them quickly and create value that way.
Yeah, turnarounds are scary. I think usually you're structuring those deals so there's very little downside.
Correct. Yeah.
And so that's the only way you can get into those things. You don't want personal guarantees. You don't want a lot of debt. You want the liabilities taken,
Yep.
that sort of thing.
So, no, you've got it.
So just a couple of minutes left. Tell us about Class 6 as an investment bank. Tell us a little bit more about what you do, how people can find you, get access to Copilot. What does that look like?
Yeah, you bet. So access to Copilot, you can actually go onto our website. It's classvipartners.com. And there's a link you can click on there and we'll make the assessment available to you. But Class 6 is an investment bank. We've been in Denver for 16 years. We've got 20 people on our team, and mostly middle market investment banking. So we do deals that are kind of in that $10 to $15 million range, up to $200 or $300 million. And industry agnostic. So we touch a bunch of different industries, and we do it because we love working with entrepreneurs, and our mission as a business is to enable the entrepreneurial spirit. And so, because we believe entrepreneurs are critical to the kind of vibrancy and success of our communities. And so we love what we do. We get to talk to entrepreneurs all day, every day, and you can't ask for anything better.
Chris, thanks so much for a few minutes of your time. We'll link to all that in the show notes. Appreciate you.
You bet. Take care, Ryan.